Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. I have a great interest in the subject of consciousness. I love human psychology. It's something that I've been interested in for quite some time. And we have a guest today who's well qualified to talk about the subject. He's an American psychologist and a professor for the Combined-Integrated Doctoral Program at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Gregg Henriques, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Appreciate it.
Well, in order to actually have a discussion about consciousness, because it seems different people mean different things by the term. When you're speaking of consciousness, what do you mean by the term? What's a good working definition?
Great. Yeah. So the first thing is Marvin Minsky is a professor that pointed this out. We want to think about consciousness as a suitcase word. So it's a good start. A suitcase word is a word that packs lots of meanings in, like God can mean all sorts of different things to people. Consciousness may be the biggest suitcase word that we have. So you want to understand what would be so to unpack consciousness, there are three big or somewhat smaller suitcases that you immediately need to identify. So first, if we start from the top here, you and I are self-consciously reflective as we're sitting here. I'm aware that I'm doing this. I've chosen to do this. I'm a self-conscious agent, which means I'm aware of myself. I'm aware of my surroundings. I'm self-reflecting on what it is that I'm doing, and we can call this self-consciousness. Okay, so that's the first higher order layer. We can drop one down in and then say, I'm awake in the sense that I open my eyes, and inside I experience the world. This is called subjective conscious experience. If you hear people talk about the mystery of consciousness from a scientific perspective, this is usually what they're referring to. This is kind of how the water of the brain gives rise to the wine of first-person experience. The taste of wine, as opposed to a bunch of neurons in there. When we look on the outside and look in at me, like all you see are neurons. From the inside, it's like, oh, I enjoy the taste of wine. And so that's subjective conscious experience. That's the second meaning. And it's also the case that consciousness refers to things like, in a broader sense even, to things like being functionally aware, aroused, and responsive. So when somebody gets knocked out, we say they're unconscious. When they wake back up, we say they're conscious. So this is the first definition, that's creature consciousness. And that very broad definition is seen from the outside. It overlaps a lot with, broad definitions of intelligence, arousal. So you get creature consciousness, which, by the way, virtually in the broadest sense, virtually all living things exhibit, in the sense that they demonstrate a certain kind of functional responsivity to an awareness to their environment. But that's not the more interesting one. Then gets into subjective experience. You probably need a brain for that, and we can talk about that. And then finally, there's self-reflective awareness, which probably is present in some degrees in higher mammals and other, maybe some birds, things like that. But then explicit recursive self-consciousness probably requires a particular kind of propositional language, or when you get language in a community, you get persons. Persons are individuals that can reflect, justify their actions on a social stage. So that's self. So basically, creature is one domain, it's the broadest. Subjective consciousness, the inside-out view, that's kind of the mystery, and self-conscious, explicit self-conscious narration. Those are the big three definitions that you want to kind of sort out.
Okay, so the way that I came across you was an article that you wrote for Psychology Today, and it was about consciousness being the hard problem of psychology. Why do you refer to consciousness as the hard problem of psychology?
Well, actually, I should be clear that we can back up a little bit. There's a hard problem of consciousness that's really in sort of the whole literature. And this is named by David Chalmers, but it's been around for a long time. But the hard problem is this.
Well, we had a bit of a glitch, but we're pretty confident that it's been fixed. And Gregg, you were explaining to us why psychology, or rather why consciousness is the hard problem of psychology.
Right. It's actually, yeah. And I was just about to say, it's really a hard problem of philosophy, meaning that we don't know exactly how to make sense and nail down what's going on when we try to say, hey, how does the brain, one way to think about it is the what and the why the brain gives rise to the subjective experience of being in the world. Okay, so we can track how the brain processes information. There are inputs, hierarchical processing, regulation, output. Okay, so sort of like a computer, we could say you function like a computer. Those are actually called the easy problems. But what is it that turns, and there's a lot that you do that's totally not conscious. But what turns those things into the magic of inner experience? Like what and why exactly do these kinds of things give rise to your experience of being in the world? Okay. Both psychology and neuroscience and philosophy, all those disciplines struggle with answering that specific question. It's the second meaning of consciousness that I talked about, self-conscious being the higher third order one, the second layered one, then the one in the base, the creature conscious. It's the second one that's really identified. It's called the hard problem of consciousness, and it's really what I like to do. So I'll stop there, see if you have any questions about that, and then go from there. That's the hard problem.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe thinkers like Gilbert Ryle, for instance, wanted to dispense with consciousness. He says it's not even really a thing. It's just a sort of a term that we use to refer to the process of our experience, or some such thing as that. I probably didn't nail it exactly, but that's the basic.
No.
B.F. Skinner, I don't know if he rejected the concept of consciousness outright. I think he did, but he thought it was a useless concept for psychology. First of all, are such thinkers correct in your view? And is it helpful to view psychology in that way?
Okay, so we have to talk about whether we're talking about philosophy or psychology and how we're talking about psychology in relation. So psychology and philosophy are not the same thing. And so philosophy is trying to get your big picture understanding of all your knowledge. Psychology is a particular kind of science. And psychology then is underneath the rule, at least depending on how you define psychology. But if you're then arguing, like B.F. Skinner said, psychology has to be a science. Okay, and the way in which the behaviorists defined what science was, actually starting with John Watson, he's the first classical behaviorist, and Gilbert Ryle's a philosophical arguer for behaviorism. His logical behaviorism is a little different than Watson's classical behaviorism, and Skinner developed radical behaviorism. Skinner and Watson are psychologists. Gilbert Ryle is a philosopher. So they're addressing slightly different things, but all of them do say we should focus on the concept of behavior, and the concept of consciousness is not terribly helpful. That's their argument, for various reasons. From a broad perspective, just a common sense language perspective, don't you have inner experience, right? You go to sleep, obviously, you wake up. Somehow, when you wake up, inside your body, at some level, there's this field of first person experience, right? And then, so at a very practical level, without even getting too scientific or too philosophical about it, how does that happen? Where the hell does that come from? That's a reasonable question from my vantage point. And Skinner basically was just saying, hey, he was an instrumentalist in terms of his philosophy. And he basically, out of instrumentalism, he would be like, that's not a very helpful frame for us scientifically. Okay, and then he didn't deny those inner experiences at all. In fact, he reframed them as behaviors, just covert behavior. That was his way of dealing with it. It's a helpful frame. I'm a fan of B.F. Skinner in some ways, and pretty similar, but just from a philosophical view. Gilbert Ryle then basically says we can just translate people, what their mental speak and dispositions towards behaving in a particular way. I think those are somewhat useful frames of reference for sure. They gather, but they leave a lot on the table, and they basically are going to frame it a particular way, and they'll gather some value framing it that way, but they don't create solutions to the issue. And I think there is an issue to be resolved. I actually divide the hard problem up into two basic issues. There's one that's a philosophical problem. Okay, and this is really how we think about the world. Okay, I'll ask you this way: does the mind exist inside the brain, or does the brain exist inside the mind? Okay.
I don't know.
So
The problem is with and it's a language problem, I think, because to say
there you
exist
go.
inside, when one thing is inside of another thing, it implies you're talking about two material entities, right? But the
Great.
mind is not a material entity. It doesn't mean it's non-existent. It just means that it doesn't exist as matter, as far as we know. So while I do think that the mind is completely dependent on the brain, I don't know if I would frame it that way. But as far as the behaviorist goes, it seems to me that the purpose of a science is to illuminate a given subject matter, to enlighten us, to inform us, to gain knowledge. And if we're trying to gain knowledge of human beings and we negate the fundamental thing that makes human beings different from everything else, then we're not really learning much at all. If you're just studying stimulus and response without studying the calculations that give rise to a given response, then you're not really explaining anything. So
Well, certainly most people are critical, and I am too. The psychology, there are about 5% of psychologists today. There are essentially no psychologists today that follow John Watson. His version of behaviorism is dead. There are like 3 to 5% that follow B.F. Skinner. That's basically died. There's a general kind of approach to psychology, which is basically behavior and mental processes that's adopting the cognitive science revolution that happened in the 1950s. And that basically then models the nervous system as an information processing system. That's the vast majority of psychology. Today, I have my whole articulation about why psychology is broken. My life is what is psychology. That's what my academic life is. And then I developed a whole series of claims, insights, theories, models, etc., that said diagnose why it was a problem and how we might overcome what I call the problem of psychology. Psychology is a profound problem of confusion. That's my area, really. So Dave Chalmers labeled the hard problem of consciousness. I actually labeled the problem of psychology, and my work is on getting clear about what that problem is, why it emerged in the literature, and then new ways of addressing and solving that.
how long has consciousness been an area of study? And as you said, it seems to you that psychology has gone wrong. In what ways? What have been some theories of consciousness?
Well, okay, so the science of psychology. So if we go back, what's happening with science? Science is getting physics established in relationship to, say, Newton. And then in the 18th century, we're getting chemistry and biology attached to this. And then in the middle of the 19th century, science is in its full. And what I mean by scientific enlightenment coming up, that way of thinking, that way of understanding the world, the methods of experimentation and data collection. And then the ideas about, well, this is the natural world and it's continuous and it has these kinds of causes in it are getting established. So in the 19th century, middle of the 1850s or so, when people start the process of defining, this is when psychology starts to get its term, they really are thinking about it as initially the science of consciousness in terms of this inside mental experience. The early psychologists are psychophysicists, which means they're tracking changes in the physical stimuli and how they change your experience of them. In fact, we get early laws of psychophysics this way. And then the most established approaches to psychology early are introspective approaches, whereby I'm going to train you on how to understand and perceive and become an observer of your own inner world. Okay, Wilhelm Wundt is the father of psychology in 1879, and he basically defines psychology this way. Then the behaviorists come along and critique it, okay, and other experimentalists critique it, the functionalists critique it. The bottom line is that lots of people critique the initial formulation. That formulation falls apart, and then there's battles, schools of thought like behaviorism, gestaltism. William James gives rise to functionalism. There's all these different battles inside of psychology of different schools of thought. After about 20 years, nobody wins. Okay, and what happens is what's called the crisis in psychology. The crisis in psychology is that depending on if you say, I'm really interested in your first person experience of the world, and I'm interested in humans, or I'm interested in the animal behavior and stimulus responses, or I'm interested in functional behavior analysis that are about adaptation through consciousness. That's William James's functionalism. Those are all very different things in the world. And psychology never gets clear about what it is about in the world, ever. Ever. It has a crisis about what it is. Nobody can decide. And then what it does is it backs up into what's called methods. So psychology becomes a science. The science of psychology is a science because it applies methods, scientific methods, on a broad array of interests, of which it has no map for. Okay? That's the problem of psychology. And then my scholarship is why. Let's be clear about what that problem is. Why did that problem evolve in the 1920s, get clearly identified as the crisis? Why did they patch over it? What is it today, and what does it mean about our knowledge of human beings, of consciousness, of how we think, that we never were able to frame and effectively characterize psychology? Okay, that's the problem of psychology. That's my area. And I built a system that actually diagnoses that and I argue resolves that.
In my view, there's two big reasons. There's probably more, but I can identify two that have caused psychology to go astray. One is the psychology has its roots in philosophy. Traditionally, philosophers were the ones who talked about these issues. Psychology, modern psychology, completely divorces itself from philosophy. In order, I think that's a big mistake, because you have to have a theory of philosophy to inform whatever investigations you're doing, what you think is important. But also, and this has happened in other fields as well, notably economics, is the success of physics has caused other sciences or other scientists or theorists to want to model their ideas on physics. But not everything can be studied the way you study physics. I mean, for instance, in any human behavior that you're studying, it's damn near impossible to have ceteris paribus situations, right? You simply cannot hold all things equal. Even if you test the same person on subsequent dates, the person is now different. He's not there, he or she are not the same person. So I think that by doing this, by severing itself from philosophy and by modeling itself on physics, you end up with, well, consciousness, it requires a philosophical perhaps explanation to explain what it is, what its purpose is. But not only that, but it can't be studied the way we studied physics. So, well, let's just get rid of consciousness. And then what you're left with is a stimulus response machine. And I think if I had to pinpoint it, that would be my idea. But I'm not a psychologist. I'm just a layman who just happened to study psychology and philosophy.
Well, it's certainly, the shorthand that you gave there is similar to the critiques that I offer. And that is, yes, I think that how to connect psychology to physics is a great question. And too many individuals engage in methodological parroting. So we're just going to parrot. That's what you're talking about. Well, we'll just do this sort of experimentation and force control, and the same basic logic that's available in physics isn't there. How do you bring that kind of method and under what circumstances? And then what are you talking about in the world? And what philosophical model are you bringing to bear? And what's the relationship between the scientist and the world? All of those are really important questions, and no one gets them right in my estimation. And the system basically, it ultimately backs up into, it creates a behavioral science methodology that I learned, and so you learn, if you're going to be a psychological scientist, you learn behavioral science methodology, which tries to justify ways of carving up the world, engaging in experiment, quasi-experimental methodology, and drawing conclusions from those basic elements. That's essentially what the science evolves into, and then it becomes a collection of mid-level theories like cognitive dissonance and various implicit bias and all these other kinds of things, where you have researchers exploring a particular thing with particular methods and then making conclusions and then bringing to, I saw you had somebody on, psychologist, I believe it was, on, hey, feeling known. Feeling known is really important. And so you're going to measure, here's 6 little items, we're going to measure that, that's got reliability and validity, and then if you have that, then we're going to go and do studies in relationship to does feeling known matter based in this quantitative analysis. That's what it means to be a psychological scientist in these days. It's got value for sure, but it's not what the system really ought to be. It's fundamentally, and the reason fundamentally is because we don't have the right philosophy. And here I don't mean like values, although I can get into those. I mean basically our understanding of ontology, that's what's real in the world, and epistemology, that's how we know it. Okay, right. And one of my big critiques is that we have a broken ontology, epistemology relation. I call this the Enlightenment gap. Okay, so the Enlightenment gap says that once physics gets a hole and splits off into natural science grounded in physics, what emerges is a failure to understand the world that enables us to ontologically, that means like we know what these concepts are, place mind in relationship to matter on the one hand. So we don't know how to define mind and place it in relationship to matter, and we don't know how to effectively rate scientific knowing, what we built with science, relative to subjective and social knowing. Okay, those are two totally, so there's an epistemological problem where we built an objective system of knowing the empirical world relative to the way we normally knew it before, subjectively and socially. That's the epistemological problem. And there's an ontological problem that says, hey, what do you mean by matter? What's your model of matter? Is it all physics? Is it all physical? What does that actually mean? Are there non-physical real world entities? What are they? How do they exist? Okay, we don't have a map for that, and thus what happens is an enlightenment, a gap in our knowledge, and leads to a chaotic, fragmented, pluralistic knowledge landscape, meaning that, everyone's grabbing parts, and we don't have the effective frame for understanding the world and our place in it. So my model basically says, let me diagnose the problems of that, and then develop a structure that enables to see very clearly where matter relies in relationship to mind ontologically, and where these different epistemological structures operate, and how they should be placed in relationship to get a coherent, integrated whole.
I definitely want to talk about your unified theory of knowledge, but I want to ask you a question about some things that I've learned in my, for instance, intro to psychology class years ago.
Sure.
That I had a big problem with. So the Milgram experiments, for instance,
Okay.
these are highly touted. A lot of people cite them, refer to them. And in reading the experiments, I had a lot of problems with them. One was they said the people kept shocking. It shows how cruel people are. But these people knew that the person in the chair had volunteered. You can't just negate that from the equation when you're trying to compare that to the obedience of Germans, for instance, in Nazi Germany. They're not the same dynamic. And then there was also the fact that it wasn't 100% of people that obliged.
Was not.
So if I boil water at 212 degrees, if I heat water at 212 degrees, it's going to boil every time. It's going to freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Human beings simply aren't just material objects. We respond to values, beliefs, things that we're thinking are going on in the environment. The Stanford prison experiments were something else. Now, I'd spent 25 years in prison, and as much as I have critiqued the prison system, the guards simply do not behave like the participants in the Stanford prison experiment. In reading the Stanford prison experiment, it was clear to me that these people were acting out a role that they thought that they were supposed to do. Then there was the studies that they've done on the attitude behavior relation. Do people actually act based on their attitudes? And they said, well, no. And how they demonstrated this was by asking them. Well, people, for one, can be unaware of their implicit attitudes and unaware of their own beliefs, and people can also lie. So to say that you're proving it based on asking, and I'm not saying that questionnaires are not legitimate or shouldn't be used, and I'm not even saying that these experiments shouldn't be engaged in, but when you put too much credence in them, when you lend too much validity to them, it becomes a problem.
Lovely. That's great. So this is one of the great issues, right? Which is what's called the transition from internal validity. Internal validity is, did you do the study the way you thought, and can you get a valid and reliable indication between the variables? That's one set of questions. So inside, Okay. And then the question is, what the F does this study mean? Okay. That's called external validity, which then gets into what's called ecological validity. Like, placed in the real world, what the hell does that thing mean? Right? Okay. And I'll tell you, the Milgram experiment shows that yes, if you structure a system in a particular sort of way, people see that almost like what I call social physics. Like when you're this, when you're given an when you've submitted to something and you give it an instruction, people will see this as a very strong set of constraints and they'll be inclined to follow it. Okay. Maybe in a way that's sort of surprising. Okay. Okay. Yeah, maybe. So there you go. Is that the interpretation of Milgram? What you don't want to do, and that's what I hear you pointing out, is, oh, we now know a law of human behavior. Humans always behave this way. Okay. Right. Oh my God. We for sure, and no serious psychologist makes that argument, in my estimation. If you make it, you're not serious almost by definition. Okay. But here's the problem, and this is what the unified theory is all about, is like, how, Michael, do we go from internal findings, and let's presume for a second that they did the study really well. I don't know if you've been following it, but the Zimbardo study, for example, a lot of shit has come out in relationship to that study, and it's like, okay. But a lot along the lines of the critique you're making, that there's a lot more role-based stuff that Zimbardo sort of hid to make it real. And this is all the questions, and I have a history of an experimenter, all the decisions we make as experimenters, what do we highlight and what do we don't, that's all internal validity questions. But then the question of the external validity is, how do we take this and assimilate it or accommodate our knowledge? Basically, what does it mean? Okay. To do that, you have to have a basic understanding of, in this case, human psychology. Okay. So we need a framework of what we mean by human psychology and how human psychology works, so we can take this piece of, if it's going to be then generalizable, we need to take this piece of data and place it in relationship to something that exists. This is what physics is able to do. For example, they have their premise and their periodic table of the elements down into the standard theory of elementary particle physics. They have a pretty nice tight network of understanding where a piece of data comes in and then gets referenced against an existing meta-theoretical paradigm, meaning a shared understanding of the broad subject matter. This is what psychology completely lacks. Psychologists have no shared understanding. They can't even tell you what psychology is based on consensus. So there's no way to get a shared expert consensus on what any data set is going to mean, because the way in which you interpret it is based on your background set of assumptions. And therefore, you have all of these mid-level theories with no shared background understanding of what it means. Ergo, the result is, and this is you asked, all of these studies can mean all sorts of different things depending on what your background set of assumptions are. Even if they were done validly, there's no background on which we can place them. And so that's a disaster from a scientific perspective, from my vantage point. And I came across this as a therapist, actually. So I'm a therapist. I'm trained also I'm a theoretical. I used to be experimental, but I only do theory now, psychologist. And I'm a clinician, somebody who does psychotherapy. So I get into the role of psychotherapy, and I want to be a scientist, right? And that's my model, and I'm a rational guy. I want to be a scientific, and I'm working in therapy. And what happens, I'm asked, here's an individual, a unique, particular, specific instance. I'm a unique, particular individual. They're showing with a set of issues, and I'm supposed to scientifically be evidence-based, meaning work with them in a scientifically informed way. Now, the problem was what I was taught were findings, empirical findings, a list, like a laundry list of empirical findings. But the question was, the way in which I'm going to take those laundry list of empirical findings, apply them to me, apply them has to be networked together into a system of understanding, or else it's more or less meaningless. Okay? So I argued that the empirical scientific argument for doing psychotherapy is unbelievably weak, in the sense that there's no framework. There's no broad framework that then would allow us to interpret the empirical findings and apply them in the specific context that we're in. Absent a framework, empirical findings are useless. Okay? Because the only way you take an empirical finding and apply them to this is through a generalizable set of assumptions. That's the only way you can do it. And if you say, well, I have a set of generalizable assumptions, you have a totally different set, psychologist B has a C has a totally different set, we all have different sets, that means we're all making sense of the Milgram study and its relevance for this in totally different ways. Oh, great. That's lovely. How the hell is that a scientifically informed approach? And basically, it's not. It fails that bar. And I'm a critique of psychology in that regard. But I don't think it has to be. There is a way to build a coherent model of human psychology. I built it. It's called the Unified Theory of Psychology. And it's the first set of ideas I did. And then I returned to the problem of psychotherapy. I built the unified approach. And then realized I basically backed up. It's like, oh my God, I built a whole framework for philosophy that bridges science and humanities in a coherent way.
So there's two issues that I see, and well, I don't know if the issues would be the right word, but two levels to look at this. Is broadly speaking, there's sort of your meta critique of psychology, that there's
Yep.
epistemological problems, ontological problems, methodological problems. There needs to be an integration that is increases the explanatory value. You need proper
That's right.
philosophical assumptions when you enter this thing. Now, within that, there are also the specific theory that you've developed to address your problem, the problems that you see. So would you agree that it's very possible that somebody could agree wholeheartedly with your overall critique, so that you could actually have agreement with a group of people, and then differ as to the specific theories that would solve the problem,
Of
so that
course.
you would be working together on one level but then disagreeing at another level?
Totally. I would say, although the field has been very good at denying this. And I mean that in the psychodynamic sense. Like, this is a real problem, but then we pretend it's not. We rationalize that it's not, and then we dance around it and don't look at the elephant in the living room. Okay, that's the way I feel psychology has been. Almost everybody that I've talked to, nobody disputes that psychology went through a crisis. Nobody disputes that psychology's ontological standing, meaning the things that it references in the world, is unbelievably pluralistic, poorly defined. Nobody argues that there is a big absence of a big theory. People might dispute how big a problem that is. Mostly they just say it's impossible. Okay. So then when you ask the question, well, okay, who thinks it's a problem and then who tries to solve it? Well, here you get into a whole, and I have my solution, and I've been working on it 20 years, and for the most part, nobody cares. And there are a few other people that work on, although I would say now this is a pretty barren territory and not too many people are working on it, but I do have contact with a few other people that have their particular models. My hope is to continue to show the viability and plausibility of this particular thing, but to convince other people that this is the right way to go is an enormous project. And so I would say, although they don't attend to it, virtually everybody agrees that it is a thing. People differ. A few people have offered solutions, and across history, quite a few solutions. Getting those solutions into agreement is basically, that's not happening. So, and very difficult to happen for certain reasons. Although I'm actually optimistic. There's a vision that I have that I think has some chance of unfolding in a positive light, but we'll see.
One of the things that I liked about Sigmund Freud was, while there's plenty where I disagree with him, but he
Mm-hmm.
did offer a broad theory
Totally.
of human
Totally.
behavior where each thing's connected to the next. It has explanatory power. Now, I mean, there's a few wacky things when he was writing and whatnot, but nonetheless, it gives you a framework from which to address the entire human. You're not just looking at over
Totally.
here, a specialist in sensation, or a specialist in perception, or whatever, a mental illness. You're explaining
Yep.
the whole person. And it seems like that's what we need in
Totally.
psychology, is a total
Totally.
explanatory revolution, really. And I was going to ask you how much progress you made, but then you said, well, no one really cares. And that to me is
Well,
disheartening, because even if,
well,
and I
yeah.
don't know, like, in reading through your framework, I didn't get into a lot of the details, a lot of the specifics. You did mention phenomenology, which tells me maybe there's some Kantian influence in there that I would probably disagree with, but it's still, when you present a field like that, it is so rich with areas for investigation and things to look at, that is sorely missing from psychology, and from my perspective.
Well, sure. So yeah, we can get into some of the specifics, but what what the unified theory does is it says diagnosis of the missing problem. We don't have the right big picture view is the short answer.
Yes.
Okay? And basically we split the world into matter versus mind very ineffectively, inelegantly, and ultimately wrongly. It's the wrong grammar. You talk, the unified theory of knowledge. It was the unified theory of psychology. It grows. But anyway, UTalk is the system I built. One of its first and core principles guiding key insights is the thing called the tree of knowledge. You can sort of see it behind me here. It's a set of upside down cones. Okay. And what it says is that this is the right map of the universe. Okay. That's relevant for our scientific knowledge. Okay. It's not matter versus mind, but actually what science has taught us is that the universe is unfolding wave of energy and information at its base. Okay. So if you collapse everything out and just go with the standard model in physics, you lose, or what happens is space, time, all matter collapses and all the four fundamental forces, and they all collapse. Okay, into what I call pure energy information singularity. There are a lot of then different models about how this jumps into through the Big Bang, but virtually every physics model now, modern physics model, has beneath matter, there's stuff going on at various levels. So this says, hey, underneath, it just follows, I studied a lot of science, it just grabs the key concepts, and over what unified theory does is it grabs the common sense key concepts from many different places and then integrates them. So complexification is being differentiated and integrated. So what unified theory is really a process of complexification where it takes the insight, grabs it, and then places it in a network of other insights that keep an integrated, differentiated coherence. Okay, so one insight from physics is that underneath the matter object layer of Newton is an energy information implicate order. I take that from David Bohm, whatever. I don't get into Bohmian stuff, but I use that term. And underneath our matter object field is quantum fields. That's what quantum mechanics and the quantum field theory. There's the basically vibrating fields of energy. I would argue energy information is the better description. Then out of that comes the three-dimensional matter. There's a jump from sub-physics into and quantum processes, which really are potentia, and then they jump into frozen matter at the matter object level. And then we can track the evolution of complexification in matter, at least if we're following our history. We follow that up into life. Okay. And then life jumps into another dimension of complexity. There's not a new substance, but there are novel processes of complexification that occur with life that are different at the matter level. There's continuity, but then there's a feedback loop that gives rise to discontinuity. And that feedback loop gives rise to discontinuity in a way that gives rise to the tree of life. Okay, whereby living is operating at a higher order of complexification as it metabolizes the underlying material object structure. And it does it through a particular kind of information processing and communication network. Think about genes and the way cells are operating, the way they're detecting their environment, showing creature consciousness to maintain their self-organization, survival, and afford reproduction. That's what they're basically organized to do. But they're an information processing system, and I can specify what I mean by that, that affords action in the world that enables them to maintain self-organization and reproduction. Fast forward up into what's called the Cambrian explosion, okay, about 530 million years ago, and a weird thing happens in a little line called animals. And what you get with animals are brains and complex active bodies that allow them to get up out of sort of the chemical cellular soup and move as whole multicellular bodies with a brain. Okay, that's another higher order information processing system. And the movement of the animal as a whole is a whole nother dimension, which actually I call mind. Now, this is a new definition of framing for mind, but it refers to mindedness, which is the complex active patterning of animals with complex active bodies and brains. Okay, in other words, what Skinner said was behavior, I actually call mind. And we can get into why I'm justified in using that term, but it solves an ontological problem, and I think it's totally justified, and I give very clear definitions that actually we're missing mindedness in nature, okay? So I would encourage all your listeners, I do when I'm given this little spiel, go to the woods, and you'll see the physical matter object with the stream and the rocks, that will be there, and then you'll look at the moss and you'll look at the plants, and those are living organisms. And then you should look at the birds and the bees and the squirrels, and you should not say, oh, they're alive. You should say they're minded, because they're both alive and they have a complex active body mediated by a nervous system that's got a whole nother layer of information processing communication. Virtually every system differentiates animals from plants. That's how you want to do it. And actually, I call them minded animals as opposed to living organisms. And then finally, you get to us, whereby us as talking apes gave rise our talking process. Other animals, of course, communicate, but our language system is a very different kind of information processing. Other animals have some symbolic information. We have what's called a symbolic syntactical information. It gives rise to propositions. Propositions gives rise to question-answer dynamics and reason-giving behavior. Reason-giving behavior is a game changer, and it sets the stage for the evolution of the culture-person plane of existence. So the humans then, by virtue of self-recursive talking, give rise to the problem of justification and the construction of justification systems. That's one of UTalk's central insights. In fact, in 1996, I made this insight. And what it does is it cleaves human consciousness and culture from the rest of the animal kingdom. And then with this map, you can then really start to place, it's an energy, matter, life, mind, culture map with these joint points in it. There's basic psychology that's getting at minded animal. It needs to be separated out from biology. And then there's human psychology, which is the base of social sciences. That's once we get into this another layer at the individual level. And then the rest of the social sciences are trying to regulate this culture person plane of existence, especially if you add technology to it.
Now, what about human volition? Is volition a part of your system, or do you look at human beings as just determined entities?
Right. So I think that this is a fallout of the bad grammar of the Enlightenment gap. I'm sort of, in other systems you would call me a compatibilist, but I don't like that term in the sense that I think the whole grammar is all broken. Okay. So I am a self-conscious agent. That's descriptively. I'm a self-conscious agent. And there are behaviors that are regulated by my self-consciousness, my egoic structure. Okay. By the way, the justification hypothesis says what a result is a mental organ of justification on the minded animal. Okay. So we have, which I call the ego. Your private version is your ego. Your public version is your persona. And you have to regulate your justificatory attitudes in the social world as via persona. That means you have to take into consideration what other people and how you're going to influence them. Doesn't mean you put on an imposter mask, although some people do, but it just means you regulate in relation. And then your ego is your I-based narrator on your animal me. Okay. And that is a justifying system. And then this justifying system engages in strange self-causal loops. Hey, I want to go on a podcast. Hey, I can justify whether or not I want to go on a podcast. Hey, I can see myself across time. This is called a strange causal loop. Okay. And humans are clearly self-conscious agents that engage in strange causal loops that have causal consequences. Okay. Now, do you call that free will? If you call that free will, then I guess I'm a free willer. Many people want to use a different frame for free will, or at least if you're extreme libertarian, then all of a sudden you start to violate some basic assumptions of physics that I wouldn't want to violate, and then I think you can get into some serious kind of problem. But I'm a firm believer in self-determination. I am a self-causal agent. I'm engaged in a recursive loop. There's a level of self-conscious determination that I'm engaged in that's different than animals that don't have self-conscious recursivity. And animals make different kind of decisions than plants do. And plants even make some kinds of decisions that rocks don't. So there's layers of agency in the world. Self-conscious human beings, I would argue, unless you believe in God or whatever, self-conscious humanity, whether clusters of individuals can make certain kinds of choices, you can get what would be the contingencies there. But certainly an individual can certainly engage in self-conscious decision-making for sure.
I like it. I want to tell you a story before I let you go. As a therapist, okay. I think you might get a kick out of it. When I was about 17, I was always in trouble in school. So whatever school I went to, they had on, staff counselors, therapists, whatever. So they gave me a psych eval when I must have been 16 or 17. I don't know. And it was a thematic apperception test. Now, I didn't know that term at the time. I learned it later. But they showed me a picture of a little kid. The lady showed me a picture. It was a little kid sitting on a porch crying. And she says to me, "What does this bring to your mind?" And I said, "I'm not answering that question." And she says, "Well, why not?" I said, "Because there's nothing I can say in relation to a little kid crying on a step that's going to reflect well on me." Right now, I didn't formulated properly at the time. But later on in life, I realized that what I'm talking about is there was an implicit bias in this picture. It was meant to evoke a sad response, anger, depression. There was nothing that I was going to say. It looks like this young kid is having a very well-adjusted life to his mother and father who are functional parents. That wasn't going to be the answer. And I just wonder if you think that that type of thing is an issue if you're trying to assess the mental well-being of a 17-year-old, for instance.
Right. Okay, so the reliability and validity of a thematic apperception test sucks. I mean, anyone that studies this knows that that sucks. What does that mean? It means it's got serious measurement problems. Like, it doesn't do a good job measuring. If you don't have reliability is, can you measure the thing over and over again? Imagine it this way. You go on a scale and one time you get on the scale and it weighs you as 75 pounds.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you get on a scale and it weighs you as 225 pounds. Throw the scale out, right? And that scale sucks. You can't, how much do you weigh? Well, if you get 75 pounds one time and 225 pounds another, you have shit reliability, okay? Then that sucks. The TAT, people have tried to work on this. TAT basically has horrible reliability. And then you have, if you don't have reliability, you don't have validity. So all of a sudden the whole thing's gone. Then the question about validity. So here's what should have happened, okay? Here's what should have happened. A, let's talk about how you are justifying yourself in relationship to the world. I didn't want to dump into you. So we can look at you as what's your, so from a UTOC perspective, I want to come in and say, hey, how are they justifying what they're doing? And how are you responding with your justifications? Notice now we can immediately place them. Well, I'm a psychologist and I'm going to test and I'm going to do this. And then the legitimizing system is going to say, well, they have power and they have license and you're just a troubled little kid. You got to sit there and listen to it. And you had a little bit of oppositional defiance in you and you were like, God damn, I'm not taking this BS. Right? Okay. So let's have a language in psychology that zooms back and allows us to talk about real human interaction based on theory rather than make up these games absent any kind of structure that allows us to have consensual interpretation about what they're talking about. It's ridiculous.
All right. Excellent. Gregg,
so that's my answer to that.
I like the answer. Gregg, where can people find you?
Yeah, so I have a little community called UTOC. I'll send you, people can check that out. They can reach out if they have interest in learning about that. My life partner actually loves UTOC too. She guides people on that. We're setting up a new website. We're going to start a whole UTOC society, but I'll give you a link. You can certainly even email me directly. Okay. So you can go to UTOC Society, check that out, get guided there, or if you have a question directly to me, shoot me an email. That's fine too.
All right. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
All right. Well, happy to do it.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.
Till next time.